After walking in the forest for about an hour, all of a sudden they were hit by a very strange sound. The sound of a baby crying. What's up, guys, and welcome to today's story. Now, this one's another creepy one, so pop in those headphones, dim the lights, and enjoy. Now, today's story was shared to me by a guy named Russell. Now, it isn't as much Russell's story, but he is the one that's shared it with us. Now, Russell was born and raised in the Philippines. As far as I know, he does still live there. When he was a kid, he befriended a neighbour called Alex. Now, him and Alex used to spend a lot of time together after school, weekends, things like that. They grew a pretty good bond together. And this one specific time, Alex invited Russell round for dinner. And Russell was thrilled, so he of course said yes, he'd love to. This was the first time that he had been invited round for dinner. So this was the first time that Russell actually met Alex's dad. Now, they lived in a building that they were constructing or helping to finish, so it wasn't their house as much, but anyway, during dinner they were having a great time, chatting amongst themselves, and towards the end, for some reason, Russell decided to ask Alex's dad if he believed in the paranormal, and he was pleasantly surprised when Alex's dad said, yeah, I do. And they kind of egged him on and said that, have you got any stories to share? And Alex's dad did. So he told them this story about his encounter with a creature called the tianak. Now, for the sake of the story, because I'm not sure what Alex's dad's called, we're going to call him Mike for today. So when Mike was a young adult, him and his brother would quite often go into the local town to sell vegetables at the market. They did it a lot, and this one specific time they ended up selling all their vegetables relatively quickly. So they thought, what should we do now? So they decided to go watch a movie. Now, in the Philippines back then and now, really, they suffer a lot with poverty. So a lot of households don't have electricity, let alone a TV. So they didn't have a TV at home. They didn't go to the cinema. What they did is they went to somebody's house who would have like a communal room, and people would pay to go in and watch movies. So back then they had VHS, and they went round to this person's house to watch a couple of movies in the end. So they watched a couple of movies, and it got quite late. They decided, rather than going home along the roads, let's take a shortcut and we'll head through the forest. Which Mike, quote, said was a big mistake. So as they'd entered into the forest, they'd been walking for a couple of minutes, and they suddenly noticed that it was actually getting a little darker quicker than they had originally anticipated. So although they were a little bit hesitant, because they had taken this track many times before, but it had always been in broad daylight. They'd never taken it in the dark before, so they were a little hesitant, but they thought, they'll be fine. They walked quickly, they would be able to get through and past out the other side before, it gets too dark. So they took the trail and started on their way. Now, they had been walking for roughly about an hour by this time, and it had got really dark. It was coming towards like the midst of the night. It must have been about 10:30, but they were lucky enough that it was a clear sky, so the moon was bright, and it was clearing up the trail ahead, so they could clearly see the route that they needed to take. But down the trail to the sides, the tree line, it was a vast forest, so if they were to for some reason verge off course into the trees, it would be very dark. Not quite pitch black, but it would be dark because of the tree tops over the top. They were flush and full, so the moonlight couldn't pierce through the leaves, so you could see, but it was dark. But if they kept to the trail, it was fine because of the moonlight. So they were continuing to walk, and there was a few noises, but nothing out of the ordinary. The wind blowing through the leaves, the rustling of the ground of a nearby woodland creature running about, but nothing nothing strange. Now, as they continued to walk, all of a sudden they noticed that it went silent, but unusually silent. At this time of night, there's bound to be little bits of noises, but it went eerily quiet. And they noticed and looked at each other, but neither of them said anything because they didn't want to unsettle each other. So they just continued on, and then all of a sudden they stopped dead in the track because they heard the most unnerving sound that they'd ever heard before. Not because of what it was, but because of where they were. They were about 2 kilometers from the nearest town by this point, so civilization was at a distance, not nearby. And what they heard was a piercing child's cry. Now, if you'd been walking through a town and heard a child crying, you wouldn't really think too much of it, and you would quickly go to aid. But in the middle of a forest at 10:30 at night, to hear a child crying is very, very unnerving. So they looked at each other and they kind of, for 30 seconds or so, discussed amongst each other what on earth is going on. We're in the middle of the forest. What should we do? But they thought they can't just walk past and leave, so they walked off the trail into the trees to try and work out where this cry was coming from. So they went into the woods, and they'd got probably about 25 meters into the trees, and they heard the noise again. And it would come from a completely different area from what they'd originally heard. They were following where they heard the cry into the woods, and then in a straight line, maneuvering through the trees. And then when they heard the cry a second time, it was as if it moved. So they were a bit hesitant again to think, this sounds like a baby's cry, or at least a very young child. Why would the child move from one location to another if it was in distress? But again, they thought to each other, we can't really just leave a child. We really don't know. Even though it's a bit unsettling, we need to go and check it out. So they verged off and they went in the other direction, and to where they just heard the second cry. So as they're walking towards, they get to a relatively large tree, and they can hear a noise from the other side. So they both separate either side of the tree and they walk round, and as they peer round the side of a tree, they're shocked at what they see. But they see a child about 1.5, 2 years old, a boy, and the weirdest thing is that he's naked, he's not wearing any clothes. So as they stop for a second because of the sheer shock of what they've just seen, and as they step a little closer, the child kind of scurries off into the woods a little way. And they, without thinking anything of it, because they've just now seen a child, they take off after it. And they go into the trees a little further. It doesn't go too far, and it stops again. And they say to him, are you okay? Everything okay? We're here, don't worry. And they had little grumbles and little groans back. So Mike's brother thought, you know what, we need to do something. Let's just take the child and we'll start heading back the way we came to the nearest town. So, because they still had about another 1.5 hours of a journey in the way of their home, so they thought they'd go back to the nearest town, as it was more than likely they would find somebody there who at least knew something, or if they didn't, they could drop the child off at a police station or something. So, they felt they were doing the right thing. So Mike's brother picked up the child, held him in his arms, and they started walking back the way they came. Now, they hadn't gone too far in, so they remembered roughly the way they came, but they could still kind of see the slight brightness of the trail that they'd been on, so they started walking back towards the trail. And as they started walking, Mike was ahead, Mike's brother was behind, and they're walking, and Mike, for some reason, stops for a second to bend. I think he bends down to tie up his shoe or something like that, and so Mike's brother walks past. As Mike stands up and he looks at the child, he lets out a blood-curdling scream. Mike's brother instantly stops and freezes, and he's thinking, what on earth is Mike screaming at? And he doesn't really do much but stand completely still, and then he slowly turns round to where Mike is standing behind him, looking directly at him. Or should I say, at the child. And Mike's brother just notices Mike says nothing, but just slowly lifts his hand up and points at the child. Mike's brother's thinking, what? So he takes the child and looks at it and is completely stunned. The child is not human. The child is covered in a dark, dirty, grey skin. He's got red, piercing eyes and really sharp, dagger-like teeth. Tiny little sharp dagger teeth. And he's fixated at this creature, who lets out another scream. And Mike's brother drops it. And this little creature scurries off into the woods. And they hear another scream, and the two men just run. They run in the direction they think they need to go, and they just started running. Whatever direction, if they head home or into the town, it doesn't matter, they just need to get out of this forest as quickly as they possibly can. So they just start running, and one last time they hear a distant cry behind them, and they're so spooked they just keep going until they end up back into the town. They'd ended up turning the wrong way and they ended up back in the town, but they didn't care. They went to a police station and they told the story. They said what they'd just seen, and obviously they weren't believed, but they went home, but they decided to go the way of the roads this time, and they never went into that forest ever again. Daylight, nighttime, they never did. They stuck to the roads. And one bit of advice that, Alex's dad, Mike, said to him is, if you're ever in the woods or the forest or the jungle at night and you hear a baby crying, run.
Now, what they just encountered was a tianak. Now, a tianak is a vampire-like creature in Philippine mythology that takes on the form of a toddler or baby. Although there are various types, it typically takes on the form of a newborn baby and cries in the jungle to attract unwary travellers. Once it is picked up by the unfortunate passerby, it reverts to its true form and attacks the victim. The tianak is also depicted to take malevolent delight in leading travellers astray or even abducting children. While various legends have slightly different variations of the tianak folklore, the stories all agree on its ability to mimic an infant, able to imitate an infant's cry or for luring victims. In some legend, the tianak may take on the form of a specific child. In one version, it retains the general shape of a baby, but then forms sharp claws and fangs to attack its victims. In another, it shares certain similarities with dwarfs and is similarly associated with the earth. In this version, the true form of the tianak is that of a little old man with wrinkled skin, a long beard, moustache, flat nose, and eyes the size of peseta coins. The same story says that a tianak is relatively immobile because of one leg is shorter than the other. This deformity forces it to move by leaping or crawling rather than walking, making it difficult to hunt or stalk victims, but its ability to mimic an infant's cry compensates for this disadvantage. There are various stories in how tianaks came to be. The Mendea people of Mindanao claim that the tianak is the spirit of a child whose mother died before giving birth. This caused it to be born in the ground, thus gaining its current state. With the Spanish colonization of the Philippines in the 16th century, the tianak myth was integrated into Catholicism. The tianak in the Catholic version was supposedly the souls of infants that died before being baptized. In modern day Philippines, the definition has extended to that of aborted fetuses that return from death to seek revenge on those who deprived them of life. It is also said that the tianak cannot go to the afterlife because of not having a name. This causes them to be earthbound creatures which wander around searching for someone to give them names. In local belief, various countermeasures are supposedly effective against the tianak. Those that were led astray by the creature's cries are believed to be able to break the enchantment by turning their clothes inside out. The tianak finds the method humorous enough to let go of the traveller and go back to the jungle. Loud noises like New Year's celebration, loud bangs, fireworks, things like that are also thought to be enough to drive the tianak away from the vicinity. It supposedly can be repelled by similar things that repel vampires, like garlic. And it's also believed that giving a name to these creatures will bring them peace, and offering a white candle will help guide its spirit to the afterlife. Now, although there's many skeptics out there who believe that the tianak is nothing other than a made-up creature, but there are many people out there that believe that it is in fact a real life creature, and people have stories of encountering them.
So that's it, guys. Thanks for listening to today's story. Hope you enjoyed it. Now, I've had a few suggestions come in from people, so those are going to be the stories I'm doing over the next few weeks. So keep them coming. Don't be shy. My Instagram is in the link below, so make sure you follow me, send me a direct message with a story suggestion, or write it in the comments below, and I will be sure to check them all and hopefully do one of the stories. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you at the next video.